Great Smoky Mountains. National Park welcomes travelers with an endless sea of green and the dense fog that gave these mountains their name. In the year 2015, this ancient silence was broken by a disappearance that still provokes fierce debate among experts and frightens even experienced gamekeepers. The event that took place here went far beyond a normal search operation and turned into an equation that cannot be solved. The man didn't just disappear into the forest thicket, as has happened dozens of times before. This case left digital traces that directly contradict the laws of physics and biology. The only impartial witness to the incident was a high-end fitness bracelet worn on the missing woman's wrist. This device, designed to ensure safety and health monitoring, recorded an anomaly that was later labeled the vertical paradox. Just 15 minutes after the jogging started, the electronics recorded the man's instant cardiac arrest. The heart rate dropped to 0 in a fraction of a second, which usually means instant death. But the most frightening thing happened at the same time as this medical collapse. At the very second when the heart stopped beating, the device's barometric altimeter showed a sharp jump upwards. The instruments recorded the body's movement to an altitude of 3,000 meters. These dry figures, stored in the device's memory, paint a picture that the mind refuses to accept. A man cannot soar into the stratosphere in an instant without the aid of aviation. However, that morning, military and civilian radars showed clear skies, and no aircraft were detected within a radius of 100 kilometers. The case became one of the darkest episodes in the park's history, presenting the investigators with a frightening choice. They had to decide exactly what they were seeing in front of them. It could have been an unprecedented technical failure caused by a rare atmospheric phenomenon, or the technology had documented with cold precision an event that lies beyond our grasp of reality. The story of this disappearance begins not with a cry for help, but with a set of impossible coordinates. The identity of the missing person only adds weight to the mystery. Michelle Carter, at the time of her disappearance in 2015, was a 32-year-old woman at the peak of her physical fitness. She was not a naive hiker who could carelessly step off the trail for a beautiful photograph. Michelle was an experienced ultramarathoner who was used to grueling workloads and challenging routes. Her training allowed her to cover dozens of kilometers of rugged terrain while maintaining mental clarity and control. Michelle Carter's very name would later gain a dark, public profile, but for a very different reason. 2 years later, a high-profile criminal case involving another woman with the same first and last name would unfold in the United States. The tragic coincidence of names would create an additional aura of fatalism around the disappearance in the Great Smoky Mountains. Journalists and researchers would get tangled up in archives, stumbling across court records or reports of a disappearance in the mountains. It was as if fate itself had decided to confuse the traces, mixing two different tragedies into one information vortex. However, the protagonist of this story remains the site itself. Great Smoky Mountains National Park has long been infamous among prospectors who call it a takeover area. Dense forests, deep ravines, and constant fog make it the perfect geocache. Disappearances that go unsolved for decades occasionally occur here. Old-timers of the rescue service still remember the case of Dennis Martin, who disappeared back in 1969 and whose fate remained unknown. Even more fresh in the huntsman's memory was the case of Derek Lucking, which occurred in the year 2012. His car was found abandoned at Newfound Gap, with a frightening note beside it that said, "Don't follow me." Derek was never found, seemingly vanishing into thin air. Michelle Carter's disappearance fit perfectly into this frightening string of unsolved cases. She was just another point on the park's map, where reality meets the unexplainable, making even skeptics shudder at the thought of what lurks deep within the ancient forest. The morning of that fateful day started out deceptively calm. Michelle Carter had prepared for her run with the usual care of a professional. She was well aware that the mountains do not forgive mistakes, so her equipment was selected perfectly. She wore quality running clothes to protect her from the wind and shoes with aggressive tread to grip the rocky ground. Every detail of her gear said she planned to return, not disappear. Technology was a special part of her training. Michelle used a state-of-the-art fitness bracelet equipped with a global positioning module and barometric altimeter. Before heading out, she activated a real-time tracking feature known as Live Track. This technology allowed her loved ones to see her location on a map to within a few meters. It seemed simply impossible to get lost in the 21st century when your every step was being broadcast via satellites. The weather at dawn also contributed to a false sense of security. The sky was covered with high cloud cover, but the air remained calm and still. Forecasts had mentioned the possibility of precipitation in the afternoon, but at the time of the start, there was no sign of trouble. The mountains stood in majestic calm, only lightly shrouded in morning haze. It was perfect training weather, cool and crisp, allowing you to breathe easy. Michelle's husband, who was away from the park at that moment, received a notification of the start of the workout on his smartphone. He saw the small digital dot begin its journey along the route, steadily moving deeper into the wooded area. This was routine for him, a familiar ritual that had been repeated hundreds of times. He had no way of knowing that he was watching the last moments of his spouse's life in our world. The phone screen glowed with a calm light, creating a complete illusion of control over the situation. Michelle took to the trail, leaving the noise of civilization behind. She was confident in her strength, in the reliability of her equipment, and in the stability of the weather. Around her, the century-old trees were rustling and the smell of wet pine needles. At this moment, the world seemed absolutely logical and predictable. No one could have guessed that in 15 minutes, this ordered reality would be shattered by an event that would turn an ordinary jog into one of the most mysterious stories of our time. The mechanism of the catastrophe was triggered, not by a roll of thunder or the sound of falling, but by a sudden, digital silence. Michelle's husband was hundreds of kilometers away from the park at the time and could only observe her movement through the glowing screen of a smartphone. The real-time tracking technology drew a clear line of the route that crept steadily upwards on a virtual map of the area. It was a routine monitoring procedure that the families of many professional athletes who leave for solitary training in the wilderness are accustomed to. A small dot on the screen pulsed, transmitting coordinates every few seconds, confirming that the runner was on the move and everything was going according to plan. However, 15 minutes after liftoff, an event that would later be called a digital scream occurred. The signal didn't just disappear or weaken, as it does when entering a dead zone or ravine. The dot on the map disappeared instantly, as if the device had been physically destroyed or switched off by someone's hand. The software gave a connection error, and the screen froze on the last coordinates transmitted. It didn't look like a battery drain, as the charge level was 100% before it went out. It looked like a momentary disconnection from reality. For the first few minutes, my husband tried to find a rational explanation for what was happening. He updated the app and checked the quality of his own internet connection, hoping that it was just a temporary failure of the satellite network. But anxiety grew with every second of silence. Attempts to call Michelle's phone resulted only in the cold voice of the answering machine, which informed him that the subscriber was unavailable. At that moment, the idyllic image of a sunny morning began to crumble rapidly, giving way to a cold realization of distress. The intuition of loved ones often works faster than official protocols. Michelle's spouse sensed that this communication breakdown was of an unnatural nature. He didn't wait for the controlling return time they had negotiated the day before. but immediately contacted the park rangers. His voice shook as he explained to the dispatcher on duty that an experienced ultramarathoner had simply disappeared from digital radar in a place where the trail should be safe. The appeal was the first official document in a case that would soon stump the region's top search teams. The alarm was relayed to the park patrol, and the nearest ranger crew moved out to the last known coordinates. The drive took about 40 minutes, and during that time, the nature of the Great Smoky Mountains began to show its unpredictable nature. The sky, which had recently been relatively clear, began to darken rapidly, casting a leaden weight. Experienced park staff immediately noted the sudden change in pressure. Their ears pricked up, and the air became thick and electrically charged, foretelling the imminent onset of a powerful storm. When the rescuers arrived at the point where Michelle's digital trail broke off, they were met only by the deafening silence of the forest. They expected to see signs of a fall, perhaps an injured runner or at least dropped items. But the trail was completely empty. The ground in this spot was soft enough to retain the prints of trainers with aggressive tread, but the surface seemed untouched. It was as if Michelle had reached an invisible wall and simply ceased to exist in the physical world, leaving no clue for those following her trail. It was at this point that the rescuers encountered their first serious contradiction. The last coordinates pointed to the middle of a gentle section of the trail, where it was virtually impossible to fall into a precipice or get lost. There were no dense thickets to hide in, or turbulent rivers that could carry a body away. Logic dictated that the man must be here, or very close by, but a visual inspection of the sector yielded zero results. The rangers began to widen the search radius, shouting the missing woman's name. But the forest swallowed their voices, not even returning an echo. The atmosphere around us began to change physically. The sharp drop in atmospheric pressure that preceded the storm created a sense of disturbing unreality about what was happening. Meteorologists would later confirm that a powerful cyclone was forming over the park at exactly those minutes. This natural phenomenon would play a fatal role in the investigation, becoming the very factor that would later be called the storm alibi. It was as if the element had waited for the moment of the disappearance on purpose, in order to hide its secret from the eyes of people. The first drops of rain hit the ground as the group realized the gravity of the situation. Along with the rain came the famous smoky fog, dense and white as milk. Visibility was reduced to arm's length in a matter of minutes. Rescuers who had been in control a moment ago found themselves disoriented and isolated from each other by the white veil. Static crackling appeared on the radio stations, interfering with coordination. The emotional state of the search team teetered on the edge of professional stamina and primal fear. People who were used to working in the mountains described their sensations as a sudden claustrophobic attack in the open. It seemed to them that the fog was not just hiding the terrain, but actively resisting their presence. One of the veterans later admitted in a report that he felt a heavy stare from the white mist. Even though the thermal imaging cameras did not show any living objects in the search sector, the shock was heightened by the realization that they were in the epicenter of the extinction zone, but could do nothing. The high-tech equipment they had hoped for was useless in the face of the elements. Powerful torches only highlighted the wall of fog in front of their eyes, creating a blinding glare. The rescuers were forced to move practically by feel, risking falling off the wet rocks themselves or getting injured. The feeling of helplessness before nature overwhelmed even the most resilient members of the operation. Michelle's relatives, arriving at the headquarters of the search operation at the foot of the mountain, faced a terrifying uncertainty. They found it difficult to accept the fact that in the 21st century, with precise coordinates, rescuers could not locate a person in a small patch of forest. The officials tried to remain calm and assured that it was only a temporary difficulty. but their eyes were filled with confusion. No one could explain how an experienced athlete could disappear so quickly and without a trace, leaving not even a broken branch behind. The situation crossed the critical line when the storm hit the mountains in full force. The wind intensified to squalls, breaking tree branches and turning the rain into icy cartridges. The head of the search operation was forced to make a hard decision that effectively signed the verdict of the quick search. Air support was completely canceled. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras and powerful searchlights remained on the ground, pinned to the concrete of the airfields by squally winds and zero visibility. It became the one surgical loss that changed the entire course of history. A golden hour critical to saving the casualty was irretrievably lost. Instead of a swift evacuation, the operation became a dangerous and slow struggle against the elements. Rescuers realized that every hour of delay reduced the chances of finding Michelle alive, especially given the missing person's lightweight sportswear, which was not designed to protect her from the ice storm. The water was rapidly turning the mountain trails into churning torrents of mud, washing away any potential evidence. If there had been any signs of struggle, footprints or blood, they were gone forever, washed away by the merciless downpour. Nature had acted as the perfect accomplice, cleaning up the scene with the thoroughness of a professional forensic scientist. The rescuers had only to record the forest closing in on them, becoming an impregnable fortress. By the evening of the first day, it was clear that the search operation was entering a protracted phase. The hope of finding Michelle in hot pursuit was washed away by the rain. The staff prepared for a multi-day siege of the forest, not yet knowing that the main mystery awaited them. Not in the thicket, but on the servers of the cloud storage. While the men were battling the mud and cold on the ground, the digital data from Michelle's bracelet was already storing information about an impossible vertical jump that would forever change the perception of the case. But at that moment, the rescuers saw only a wall of rain in front of them and felt the icy breath of the mountains. The storm that hit the Great Smoky Mountains turned the search operation into a logistical challenge. Traditional methods of combing the area became not just futile, but deadly to the rescuers themselves. The headquarters leadership understood that sending people into the forest, where visibility is less than a meter and squally winds blow down centuries-old trees, means risking more casualties. The operation ran into a deafening wall of the elements, which seemed to be deliberately protecting its prey. At this point, the search tactics underwent a dramatic change. If physical access to the place of disappearance was closed, there was only one way left that the storm could not block. It was a path through digital space. The temporary headquarters set up in the park's administration building had become a data center. While the weather raged outside the windows, breaking branches and flooding the windows with water, there was a tense silence inside, broken only by the clatter of keys. A team of technicians called in from the city set about trying to hack into the cloud storage of Michelle's fitness tracker. It was an unconventional improvisation, dictated by desperation. The rescuers hoped the device had time to synchronize at least some of the data before the signal dropped. Each minute of waiting seemed like an eternity, because access to the server could provide clues as to which square to look for the woman when the storm subsided. Working with digital footprints required as much stamina as hiking a mountain. The process of restoring access was complicated by the security protocols established by the device manufacturer itself to protect user privacy. Specialists had to bypass multiple layers of authentication using legal queries and technical tricks. In this stuffy room, lit only by the blue light of the monitors, the fate of the operation was decided. People understood that without these coordinates, they would be looking for a needle in a haystack that sprawled over hundreds of square kilometers of impenetrable thicket. It was in this phase of adaptation that the true nature of modern prospecting became apparent. It was no longer just a fight against nature, but a high-tech investigation. Investigators analyzed cell tower billing, trying to catch even a shadow of Michelle's phone signal. They built complex mathematical models of the possible movement of the runner, taking into account terrain and weather conditions. Improvisation became a new strategy to keep hope alive even when the forest was locked down with a storm warning. Everyone realized that as soon as the skies cleared, they had to have a precise plan of action based on more than just intuition. On the second day, the elements relented a little, changing the fierce storm into a monotonous, exhausting rain. This allowed the ground teams to resume their work, but conditions remained hellish. The forest had turned into a swamp where every step was difficult. The rescuers, wearing heavy Macintoshes, slipped on soggy clay, climbed wet rocks, and waded through bushes that clung to their clothes with wet branches. The romance of the mountain trek disappeared, giving way to a harsh and dirty routine that exhausted people physically and mentally. The operation went into a protracted investigation mode. Day after day, the teams methodically combed square after square, following a strict grid of coordinates. They examined every ravine, every fallen tree, and every crevice where a man could theoretically fall. But the forest was silent. Not a scrap of cloth, not a trace of shoes, not a wrapper from an energy bar was found. It was as if Michelle had never set foot on this ground. This sterility of the scene was beginning to weigh on the psyche of even the most experienced searchers who had seen a lot in their lives. The life of the rescuers in those days was devoid of even minimal comfort. Short sleep breaks were spent in damp tents or in the interior of service vehicles, where the smell of wet wool and petrol was a constant companion. Food was cold, coffee went cold instantly, and clothes never dried completely. People worked to exhaustion, driven only by a sense of duty and the hope of finding a living person. But with every hour spent in the cold rain, that hope became more and more elusive, dissolving into the gray gloom that enveloped the mountains. Time flowed differently in this new reality. The days merged into one endless gray strip, where morning differed from evening only in the degree of light. The faces of the volunteers and professionals turned gray with fatigue, their eyes sunken, and their movements became mechanical. They had become living search machines, performing their function against their better judgment. Team leaders had to keep an eye not only on the route, but also on the condition of their men in order not to make mistakes caused by exhaustion. After all, in such conditions, one wrong step could lead to a new tragedy. By the end of the third day, the tension had reached its peak, culminating in frightening psychological phenomena. The human brain, exhausted by insomnia and constant gazing at the monotonous landscape, began to malfunction. This phenomenon is known as pareidolia, when in the noise of the wind and the outlines of branches, the consciousness begins to complete familiar images and sounds. Several experienced rescuers working in the far sector of the search reported over the radio that they heard a distinct female scream. The sound, full of pleading and pain, broke through the rain, making the blood run cold. The reaction was instantaneous. The group, forgetting their fatigues and caution, rushed towards the sound, risking the slippery slopes. They ran, driven by the hope that Michelle was alive and calling for help. It seemed to them that the voice was very near, just around the next bend in the trail or over a rock ledge. But every time they reached the source of the sound, they were met with nothing but emptiness. There was only the wind rumbling in the gorges and the creaking of old trees. It was as if nature was mocking them, imitating the human voice with frightening authenticity. These false hopes hit the morale of the crew harder than any storm. The disappointment was physically palpable. Arguments and conflicts began in the camp. Some argued that they had heard her accurately and should continue to search the same area. Others, more skeptical, spoke of hallucinations and demanded a change of tactics or to give people a rest. The atmosphere in the team became heated to the limit. The confidence of the professionals was shaken, giving way to a mystical fear of a place that was playing such cruel games with them. Whispers began to circulate among the local huntsmen that the absorption territory did not give up its captives for nothing. They recalled old legends and instances of people hearing voices in these mountains before they disappeared themselves. The operations leadership had sternly discouraged such talk, demanding that only facts be relied upon. But there were no facts, only ghostly sounds and a sense of alien presence, which was noted by many participants in the search. It seemed that the forest was watching them with thousands of invisible eyes, waiting for the moment to break their will completely. The breakthrough in the investigation didn't happen in the forest, but in the very same stuffy office where the technicians were working. After 72 hours of continuous attempts, they managed to access the full data log from Michelle's account. The cloud security system had finally succumbed, allowing access to the last synchronization that had taken place when the connection was cut. The senior analyst, seeing the numbers on the screen, at first thought the program had failed in decoding. He wiped his eyes and rechecked the source code several times, but the data remained unchanged. A silence hung in the room that was heavier than the silence of the forest. The analyst summoned the head of the search operation and silently pointed to the monitor. There, in the dry lines of the report, was an anomaly that defied rational explanation. A graph of Michelle's heart rate was showing a normal load that suddenly dropped into a straight line, signifying 0 beats per minute. It was clinical death. But simultaneously with the cardiac arrest, the barometric altimeter sensor drew a vertical line going skyward. The device recorded that at the very second, when the woman's heart stopped, she moved to a height of 3,000 meters above sea level. That jump was almost instantaneous. No living thing could make such a leap. It defied gravity, physiology, and common sense. According to the instruments, Michelle didn't fall into a ravine or get lost in the woods. It was as if she had been pulled out of reality by some unknown force that had lifted her into the clouds in a split second. This discovery completely turned the tide of the operation. The rescuers realized that they had been looking in the wrong place all along. They had been scouring the ground, looking under every bush, while the digital trail pointed skyward. It was a new fulcrum, but it didn't bring relief. On the contrary, it turned the rescue operation into something frightening and forbidding. The chief of staff stared at the screen, realizing that he would have to explain these figures to relatives and the press. And he had no idea how to do it without questioning the very reality of what was happening. The vertical jump data received was the point at which hope finally gave way to the cold logic of hopelessness. The leaders of the operation found themselves at an impasse that could not be described in standard protocols. If the instruments were to be believed, there was no point in continuing to search for Michelle on the ground. The figures nonchalantly stated that she had left the surface of the earth at the time of her death. Common sense, however, demanded that we ignore the electronic readings and continue to comb the woods. This cognitive dissonance paralyzed headquarters. Rescuers were no longer going out en route as people searching for a living person, but as participants in a strange ritual, the meaning of which was lost. The relatives of the missing woman were going through the worst phase of the tragedy. They had to choose between two versions, each of which was unbearable. The first version said that Michelle died of cardiac arrest, and the devices simply went crazy because of the storm. And now her body lies somewhere under a layer of mud, safely hidden by nature. The second version, based on trust in technology, led to the frightening conclusion that something beyond human comprehension had happened. Seeing faith fade in the eyes of loved ones was harder than fighting the weather. They waited for a miracle, but all they got was a printout with an impossible altitude chart. The active phase of the search began to wind down on its own. The resources of people and equipment were exhausted by many days of fighting the elements. Volunteers, drenched and tired, began to go home, taking with them a heavy sense of incompleteness. The Great Smoky Mountains forest fell back into its familiar silence, as if digesting what had happened. Each new group returning from the trail, empty-handed, only confirmed that the park had no intention of giving back what it had taken. It was a quiet and painful fading of the operation, with no room for a heroic finale. The official end of the search and rescue operation was announced 10 days after the disappearance. This decision was not easy for the park management, but it was impossible to continue wasting resources on the search for the ghost. The final report had written in dry, clerical language that Michelle Carter was missing, presumably as a result of an accident. The document neatly bypassed all the oddities with the telemetry data, writing them off to technical error of the equipment in conditions of abnormal atmospheric pressure. The bureaucratic machine did everything to bring the inexplicable to an understandable denominator. In fact, the denouement turned out to be frighteningly empty. Absolutely nothing was found. Not a trainer, not a brightly colored jacket, not a smartphone. Michelle had left behind no physical evidence of her presence in those woods. It was as if she had been erased from reality the very moment the sensors detected the glitch. Even the service dogs, usually infallible in finding the trail, behaved strangely in this case, refusing to go deeper into certain squares of the forest. The operation ended not with a point, but with a multi-point that dissolved into the morning fog. For the rescuers, the case was a professional trauma. They were used to finding either the living or the dead, but they always brought the person home. Here, however, they were faced with absolute nothing. In the smoking rooms and on the bases, they discussed the case for a long time, lowering their voices. No one wanted to admit out loud that modern technology and the experience of dozens of people were powerless before the mystery that these ancient mountains hide. Michelle Carter's case was archived, but it remained in the minds of the participants as an example that we do not control wildlife as much as we would like to think. The story of the disappearance at Great Smoky Mountains leaves us alone with a frightening dilemma. On the one hand, there is a rational explanation. Skeptics argue that we are witnessing a rare coincidence. A cardiac arrest on the background of physical exertion, coinciding with a sharp drop in pressure during the storm, could have caused the altimeter to show a false altitude. In this version, there is no mysticism. There is only the tragedy of a lonely death and the imperfection of our gadgets, to which we are accustomed to trust our lives. Michelle's body, according to this theory, is still out there, safely hidden by dense vegetation or covered with rocks. On the other side lie facts that cannot be ignored. The vertical paradox detected a movement of 3,000 meters in a second. If we assume, even for a moment, that the device worked correctly, we are faced with an event that breaks our picture of the world. The absence of any traces, the strange sounds heard by the rescuers, and the very atmosphere of the place, called the absorption area, add up to a different pattern. Perhaps the technicians were not mistaken, but simply impartially documented what the human mind is not yet ready to accept. Today, years later, the park's trails still attract runners and hikers alike. But those who know the story of the year 2015 involuntarily glance at their smartwatches as they enter the thick fog. This case serves as a grim reminder that the line between safe reality and the unknowable is much thinner than a smartphone screen. We surround ourselves with satellites and sensors, believing they will protect us, or at least tell us the truth about our end. But the case of Michelle Carter asks us the ultimate question. Are we ready to know this truth if it turns out to be scarier than any fiction?